QUATERMASS and the Pit. I think I've finally said it correctly, at least as
That
far
was
as
amazing.
thank you, AC. Um, Aaron Christensen of Horror 101 with Dr. AC, my guest as always for Son of Hammerland. We're going back into, not into space, but onto Earth, dealing with space beings. We talked about the QUATERMASS experiment a few months ago, and now we're talking about a sequel that came out like 12 years later, QUATERMASS and the Pit, involving our Dr. Bernard Quatermass, the
right.
sort of the proto X-Files weird G-Men kind of guy dealing with the unexplained, but he's a different character in this movie. He comes from a different country apparently, and he's played by a different actor. So
Yep.
this is almost a clean slate.
It is, and I think it does feel like it feels like a different character. And I mean, I really enjoy what Brian Donlevy does with Quatermass in Quatermass Experiment and Quatermass 2. But I also really enjoy Andrew Keir as his incarnation. So I'm curious to dive deeper into it and hear what your thoughts were as well.
Yeah, I dug the Quatermass Experiment. It came out in 1955, and the similarities between that movie and this one are striking. Both involve an alien intelligence that at one point grabs hold of the psyche of a human being, and that person kind of goes on the run. Not as much in this movie, but all sorts of weird phenomena occur around this person. And then there's a big climax involving the authorities and the media kind of converging on this one place where the alien happens to be wreaking havoc. It almost feels like QUATERMASS and the Pit is a weird remake of the QUATERMASS experiment. But there are some key differences. Like I mentioned, in the 55 movie, QUATERMASS is sort of an American shady scientist guy who's working with the British intelligence. And at the very end of the movie, I mean, I guess the seeds are kind of planted throughout, but you get the feeling he's not on the level. He's not a very, good guy. Whereas the QUATERMASS in the Pit is very much, he's trying to help essentially save the world and figure out a series of unfolding mysteries, which this movie has so many different, it's almost like a choose your own adventure. It starts off as one thing, becomes about 8 other things, and winds up being about a 9th, and it all works. I was flabbergasted watching this thing.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I feel like Don Levy's incarnation is very much he's a man of science, and to heck with humanity. It's about, does this work? Am I able to do these things? Am I, it's kind of the whole Jurassic Park, like you were so worried about whether you could do it, you stopped asking whether you should. And I don't think Quatermass in the Don Levy films, I don't think he asks a lot of whether he should. It's all about, is this possible? Can it be done? Once we find out whether it can be done, then we can find out what to do with it. But he's strictly about, let's see if we can get a man into space and back again. And, in the first one. Here, he's a much more kind of like benevolent and humanistic character.
Yeah.
And I think he is concerned. He's concerned with the fate of humanity. He's concerned about what awakening this alien intelligence will do. And whereas it's funny because his counterpart, Colonel Breen, who's kind of his antagonist, is very much about just deny. He's like fake news before fake news was a thing. He's like, nope, that's not what it is. Nope, it's fine. Everything's fine. What I say goes, and it's really, I think those two as foils work really well together. And similarly, Quatermass and his scientific counterpart, Roni, and his assistant, Barbara, like the three of them work really well together, even though they kind of feed off of one another. Quatermass sometimes is like, not so much. And then Barbara Judd is like, played by Barbara Shelley. Barbara Judd is like, I don't know, maybe you should take a look at this, and kind of turns his mind around. So I love the dynamic between those four, lead characters. I feel like we get like they do much of the driving of the narrative, and a lot of the drama comes from that. But we also get a lot of really great support from the rest of the ensemble, whether it be just like a howling mob, or we get like individual, like the minister and things like that, who are kind of thorns in the side of Quatermass, but in in an antagonistic way, as opposed to the thorns that were in his side. We're like going, you can't do that.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Colonel Breen for a moment.
Yeah.
You bring up an interesting point. The kind of the he doesn't believe anything that's being presented to him. The conclusion he comes to at towards the very end of the movie, when it's clear to just about everyone that it is an alien intelligence. And I guess we should step back a second to get to what the hell is this movie even about. So remind me to come back and talk about Breen.
Yeah, I'm happy to summarize. I have one ready and waiting.
Okay, but we don't have a lot of time, so just give the bullet points, because I think a summary of this movie could take about the same running time. Because as I mentioned, it's about everything.
Yeah, it covers a lot of ground. So the synopses that I've got here is: while working on an extension of the London Underground in Hobbs End, a construction crew comes across fossil evidence of humanoid creatures. Anthropologists Dr. Roney and Barbara Judd, as well as reluctant associates Professor Quatermass and Colonel Breen, are brought in to investigate and speculate. Subsequent diggings unearth a mysterious vessel with an impenetrable surface. To everyone's surprise, the spaceship, as is believed to be, begins to emit devastating sonic vibrations, resulting in mass violence among the neighboring London inhabitants. Who doesn't want to see that movie?
No one, I don't think.
Both of us have seen it already, so too late.
Yes. Very excellent summary. What I like are the kind of steps in between. It starts off with this extension of the London Underground. They discover a skull. Oh, maybe this was a cave-in or something, and then they discover this craft. Wait, is it a bomb? No, it can't be a bomb. Maybe it could be a bomb, but it's an advanced weapon. Wait a second, there's a skull inside the bomb, so it's got to be a craft. Then there's all this talk about this site, Hobbs End.
Right.
There's two different spellings. The older spelling with one B. Hob used to be the name of in the ancient name for the devil.
Right.
And then there's an investigation into supernatural phenomena. There's a spooked cop who said, well, this building, I thought it was haunted when I was a kid. And there's all these like scratches, like almost like little children's scratches in the walls. So you think, is this a supernatural story? Is it aliens? Turns out it's kind of both.
A little bit of everything.
And at the end, what I wanted to get to with Breen is he's, we're only talking about 30 years roughly removed from World War II. His explanation for everything, well, it might have been built to resemble an alien craft, but it is probably Nazi propaganda, like some kind of a fear tactic to help win the war, because as has been discussed, Hitler is into all sorts of like weird stuff, like occult things, and why not?
Right.
The idea that because he's a man of the military, not necessarily a man of science, but he's also a man of a very rational person. So if you're a rational person, it might make sense. Yes, we've encountered an enemy who had these kinds of things in mind, so why not? But it's he is the villain of the piece, but I don't get the sense that he's he's up to something really. He's just firmly in denial about what he's seeing because it's so unbelievable.
Right. No, he wants to, well, he wants to run things his way, because that's the military way, and there are things he can't explain and the things he can't control, and that really unnerves him. And I think that's where he kind of reverts back to just the denial.
Yeah, and the actor who played Breen, I'm going to try and find his name. Where is he? Oh, Julian Glover.
Yeah, Julian Glover.
He was, I recognized him instantly. from as the villain from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the
Yep.
guy who kind of funded the exposition and he didn't choose wisely. And he didn't choose wisely in this. He kind of ended up getting a Raiders of the Lost Ark ending, ironically. But yeah, there's so many different layers to this story, and ultimately we eventually get into this craft and discover these, you know, bug-like creatures. They're all dead, but the craft itself may not be. And there's all this weird psychic residue that starts affecting people and kind of driving them crazy. And it's so powerful that it can affect the environment. So you see, I mean, some of the scenes, it's kind of hokey, and I blame the fact that I watched this on Blu-ray because I could see strings like making
Sure.
objects move, but I can imagine those being not as visible watching it on like an older print and having the magic kind of preserved.
Yeah.
But the climax of this, where London is kind of ripping itself apart, reminded me of the climax of Life Force, which is always a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
If this movie had Matilda May in it, it would have been perfect.
Well, I mean,
kiss.
come on. I mean, come on. What movie wouldn't be better with Matilda May in it? Yeah. And I like the fact that we've got the idea that maybe the spaceship itself has life in it, that there's something, you know, like, and I mean, hats off to Bernard Robinson, our erstwhile, you know, designer of all great things, Hammer, because this is kind of the biggest kind of scope he had to work with. They had moved out of Bray Studios at that point and were over in Elstree, but when they came time to do the movie, Elstree told them they didn't have any room. And so the producer took the production across the street to MGM, which had a much bigger backlot. And that's what they were able to use for all of the London street scenes. And so they ended up with a bigger film than they'd ever had before for Hammer. And I really like that, because the ideas, I feel like, are so much bigger than any other film we've covered together, for sure. Like, we've got some huge, like, you know, brain busting ideas. So, like, you know, the origins of man and extraterrestrial travel, and the culturing of humanity, and, you know, like psychic energy, as you said, that, like, you know, can move things around in a telekinetic way. It also just controls people. We see like brain transmissions that are recorded. I mean, I think it's extraordinary. The one thing that kind of, as you said, I feel like this movie's big ideas aren't like, the movie came too soon in terms of technology. Like, it's hard to sell this idea of there's things floating in the air. And, you know, like when we see the big scene on Mars as transmitted through Barbara, you're just like, because it was hilarious. I was watching it this time, like, you know, they've gathered the room of British authorities, and Quatermass is like, you will see this and you won't be able to deny it. And everybody just kind of like looking at it. It's like this bunch of like this, like just streams and streams of little grasshoppers, you know, marching along. And like occasionally one comes up to the screen and, like, you know, gets a close up. And I'm like, okay, weird, but proof of just about nothing. I don't know that I'd be convinced of your story based on your parade of grasshoppers.
On, like, but what about the little foil? I think they're like little foil balls that would kind of pop up, and the'd be flashes like those are bombs or some kind of warfare going on.
I was like, I'm not.
It's great because some of the reaction shots of the people in the room, like they were,
yeah, right.
I think that was just B-roll of the actors on set. But no, it's funny because I watched this with my friend Bill. Bill is a huge fan of our show, and a dear friend of mine, and he's a big fan of yours. I got to get you guys together someday. But he warned me. He said he loves this movie, but it has, I think he described it as the worst special effects shot he's seen in a legitimate movie ever.
Yep.
And right as, I can't remember if he didn't pause the film just for, I think I had to take a bathroom break or something, but when I came back and sat
he's
down,
like, okay, so here it comes.
It's coming up. And like, I braced myself, and I still wasn't ready, because he didn't describe what the scene would be. He just said the special effects would stick out like a sore thumb. And boy, do they. You said this movie is sort of ahead of its time. the year after this was it was 2001: A Space Odyssey. Is that 68 or 69? I think it
I
was
believe it's
68.
68. I think so. Yeah.
Right. And Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick were working on that movie, writing it while Clarke was writing the novel famously and collaborating. But and I don't know that there is any influence there, but it's just these huge ideas coming out of kind of popular science fiction at the time.
Yeah.
You look at 2001, the idea of this alien intelligence burying these monoliths that inspire the evolution of mankind along different stages in its progression. Like it talks to the apes and helps them evolve tools, and they grow into us. They bury
Yep.
one on the moon to say, okay, now here's the key to get to the star portal. You're finally ready to come
Yep.
meet us or whatever. These same ideas or approximations of them are in this film. It's a
Well,
great companion piece.
and this has its origins in the original 6-part BBC TV serial from 58 and 59. So, like we're talking about a decade earlier that
Okay.
these ideas were coming from. So I don't know. I hadn't actually thought about the fact that, Clarke might have been influenced by Nigel Neal's original ideas. This is also one that Nigel Neal, he wrote the screenplay for, and it was part of his. He said you can't have the movie rights if you're going to get Brian Donlevy back. Like he was just like dead set against Brian Donlevy, and so they, as you say, they went from an American to a Scotsman. And again, I think Andrew Keir is just a terrific presence. You'll see him in a few Hammer movies. We saw him in Dracula, Prince of Darkness as Father Sandor. He's also in Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. And yeah, I mean, again, I really like him as an actor.
Well, I mean, Roy Ward Baker, who directed this movie, we've talked about a few of his
Yep.
films, and it's one of those, my memory is terrible. So I'm looking at IMDb. I'm like, okay, he did The Vampire Lovers, he
Right.
did Dracula and the Seven Golden Vampires,
Yep.
one of the other ones, the other Draculas we talked about. But yeah, Scars of Dracula.
Right.
And it's one of those kind of deals where I don't think you could look at this movie and make that connection back to those. At least it's not obvious to me. It just kind of speaks to his versatility as a filmmaker, because this feels like a very modern, great bit of sci-fi. And I complained about the Blu-ray, kind of showing the strings, but what it also did was bring out the rich kind of textures in these great sets, the set, I guess, working with those limited resources. Like when they're in the underground, kind of, I don't know if they're drilling, or looks like they're mining clay or something like that, but the discovering these body parts,
Yeah.
it's so rich. You feel like you're down there and you got to wash your hands afterwards.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it really is well realized. That whole London Underground is terrific. And yes, as you say, they're like, like they're taking great pains to to excavate these skulls, because they predate, if I'm not mistaken, they predate some of the fossils that Roni has seen before. They talk
That
about
was,
being like, 5 million years ago.
and that's the one thing that I probably have to go back and watch the movie again to pick up on it, but it felt like there was a bit of a leap, because I guess Roni had a theory that mankind had been around 5 million years earlier than the earliest reports or
Right.
hypotheses. And then he discovers these skulls and he's like, aha, this proves that these are 5 million years old. I'm like, they're a little misshapen, but I don't know. You got to do some carbon dating there, pal. Another movie this reminded me of, and this, again, this is all out of the context of the film itself, but it's one of the benefits of watching something like this. If you've been immersed in more modern films, you can possibly see some roots or at least draw some connections. Was Phantasm. The
Oh,
idea,
sure.
this extra dimensional in that case, and aliens in this case, kind of coming to Earth. And at one point, like, were they stealing primates and evolving them on Mars?
Yes.
Yeah, they were kind of creating this like slave race, which is, Phantasm, the tall man and his minions were doing to, taking corpses, reanimating
Right.
them, and transporting them back to their dimension to work as slaves. It's not exactly the same thing here, but again, you could see how there would be a line drawn there.
Well, and I mean, yeah, I think even after watching this a few times, I'm kind of like, wait, what was the aliens' grand scheme? Because it was like they couldn't survive on their planet any longer. I got that idea, and they couldn't survive on Earth in their current form, and so they were kind of like they were. It's almost like they were colonizing Earth with humans, and that was going to be like their legacy or something. I didn't get the sense that they were projecting themselves into humans. I think that it was just like, well, if we can't live on Earth and we can't live on Mars, we'll create the race that does live on Earth.
Yeah, it is. Because I looked up on Wikipedia before this, just kind of to refresh myself, because I watched it a few nights ago. Because there's a lot to refresh on. And they were saying that they were trying to colonize Earth. It feels like, as much as I love this film, it does feel like there is one ingredient too many in the origin of the aliens, or what they were up to, because it comes down to it at the end, and a further revelation is not only were these grasshopper aliens, from Mars, and they were working on, proto-humans, but they had essentially a genocide war, where they were purging themselves of the freaks, or the anomalies, the genetic anomalies. And then, as the psychic waves hit London, there were people who were sort of standing in factions. I don't know how they discovered or determined this, but there were people who were pure who began attacking people who were not pure. It's a great layer, but I feel like that could have been enough. You don't have to add the dying planet thing into it. It could have been like, well, this faction escaped in this ship to Earth to, they were refugees from the genocide war or something. Not that I'm trying to tell anybody how to rewrite a 60-year-old movie, but it's just, as an audience member, I'm like, this could have been a little simpler.
Well, what's interesting, and I think that's another place where the production values kind of don't live up to the ideas, is I think it would have been great if we'd had something like a life force scale, howling mob for London. I mean, we get a few interactions here and there, but it's never quite the sweep and scope that Life Force manages to pull off. But I really like the idea of the othering, where pretty much anything that isn't you is an other, and so you start attacking anything that isn't you, and which leads to the genocide. It's really kind of it's a great idea, but it also kind of like harks back to the idea of religion and racism, and it's kind of like anything that's not the way you are, because you get the sense that these grasshoppers are all kind of the same, like, and again, I feel like the grasshoppers are these little like plastic toys, and I'm like, oh, that's so cute, and wouldn't it have been great if we'd had something that was just a little more. They do it, they try to make them a little gooey, by having them, you cut into them, the green like pea soup flows out, but it would have been nice to have. I would love to see something that's like a little more like modern, like a Cronenbergian or some Lovecraftian, like something that's a little gooier, octopusy type of thing, as opposed to these, like, they look so much like grasshoppers that you can't help but think of them as, big plastic grasshoppers.
Well, I agree. My thought would be that if these things were still alive and in their original numbers, if you think of like locusts, a locust is just like a little bug, but if you get 1 million of them,
that's right.
I mean, these things are not miniatures. I think the terrible psychic home movie that we see towards the end, it places them on a scale that makes them look really small.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, but we see the ones that they're holding in their hands.
Right. They're still, maybe a quarter the size of a person.
Right.
Maybe a little bit bigger, but I could imagine two things. One, if you encountered a live one, you'd probably be so freaked out. You're like,
oh yeah,
no. But the other thing is, if you encountered a live one, even if it's short, and there's 100 of them or 1 million, then that kind of changes the story.
Agreed.
But I just drew this connection when you're talking about the kind of racism and purity that goes back again to what had happened 30 years ago with the Nazis. Now, Breen doesn't make this connection because he doesn't believe it. It would have been interesting. Right? It would have been interesting if he had drawn that connection. Like, we just got done dealing with human Nazis. Now I got to deal with space bug Nazis. I'm out of here.
Well, and I do want to talk about, I think it would have been the idea of Breen, he is kind of forced to be a little one note, in that he's so rigid. But
Yeah.
I feel like he plays that one note very well. And he is the obstacle that we need, to kind of stymie Quatermass. But I feel like, I love Barbara Shelley in this movie. Barbara Shelley as Barbara Judd, and I love James Roney, and I love Andrew Keir, because I love how kind of like they do get to play a range. Like the scene where Quatermass is doesn't recognize Roney, where he's kind of been taken over by the wave. It puts Quatermass in a situation we've never seen him before, where he's almost the victim, because that's not the case in either of the Don Levy films. Don Levy is like constantly on the outside. He's the one trying to fix things. But to see our hero basically being taken over and, almost doing his counterpart harm, it's kind of like, okay, this is where it gets dangerous, when, like the man of science is not invulnerable.
Right. I mean, because you kind of, it's weird thinking of these in terms of like being a trilogy because they involve the same character, but they're, from what I know, disconnected films.
Yeah.
But this being the latest, possibly the last, you wonder, is he gonna make it? Is anybody gonna make it? Because this
Right.
has all the hallmarks of being kind of a downer ending. One of the reasons I think that we didn't get that wider London panic is probably because of budget, but also because I get the feeling that this wave is making its way, it's radiating out. Like it's
Mm.
starting as kind of a local thing. Like it's probably made it a few blocks at this point. If it had gone unchecked and we had our giant glowing space mantis in the sky,
Yeah.
if it had not been blown up by the heroism of Dr. Roney, then sounds like the San Francisco treat. Then I think mankind in general would have been in for some big trouble. Now, I guess, was it ever inferred that there might have been other craft at other places, or did you get the feeling this was an accident, like it accidentally wound up being buried here?
Well, what's interesting is, I mean, the craft has been buried here, and I want to feel like it was almost deliberate, but the fact that the humanoid creatures, I guess that's the other question. Do we think that like these humanoid creatures are the only ones that came with the craft? And did they all just, and why did they all just die like just feet outside of the spaceship?
Well, because, and that's, yeah, that I hadn't even put that together. Because this movie goes to all these different places, I just completely disconnected the ape humanoid creatures, like slave creatures, from the grasshoppers. Like once the grasshopper characters or whatever, the locusts, aliens, come into the picture, it's kind of all about them.
Right.
There's that theory about what they were doing with proto mankind, but it's not like, we don't see footage in that flashback, at least not that I could tell, because it's kind of grainy and terribly done. But it would have been interesting to see these locusts fighting each other, getting exterminated, and then the race of these slaves like getting involved. Like, were they
Right.
muscle?
Right.
Were they also being wiped out? Like, what's the deal there?
But
But
anyway,
yeah, you bring up a good question.
I mean, I guess my point was that like the spaceship has landed here 5 million years ago, has
Mhm.
been embedded in the earth, whether it's hidden or it crashed, not sure. But every time, and I love this, every time they dig in the area, there you get these disturbances, and that's when people start going mad. And I guess it happened in the 20s, it happened in the 50s when they did the original dig for the London Underground, and now they're doing the extension. And every time they get closer to the craft, things get a little weirder and wilder. And I love that idea, and I love the shape of that spaceship. Like I love the design of it. It's unlike, they could have gone so easily the cliche, saucer route. And there's just some really great kind of like lines to that spaceship that feel unlike any other spaceship I had seen up to that point.
Yeah, I get the feeling that it's almost like one piece, like whatever material it was made of, it was carved
Yeah,
almost like someone would whittle a piece of wood, but you can fly around in it.
right.
And the material is pretty much impenetrable by human technology. But I agree, there's so much of this that's unexpected. There's almost the dig for the ship is almost a metaphor for the movie, because it seems like every time we go back down there, they've
Mhm.
revealed a little bit more of the ship, and we're getting a bit more of this overarching story.
Agreed.
Yeah, just it's masterful. Now, yeah, but I'm wondering about, because the craft didn't seem that big, and there were these remains around the craft, so I don't
Right.
know if they
Well, and I feel
fell
like they
out.
found, yeah, I feel like they found, they found a bunch of skulls. And then there was like, a bunch of like compartments where the grasshoppers were. So, I mean, grasshoppers flew down with them. The
What
Martians flew
if,
down with them.
what if, and this is wild speculation, but the spacecraft lands and they're collecting these specimens to bring back to the planet, or maybe they're dropping them off and then something happened to prevent them from taking off again.
That's
Like maybe
good.
they didn't crash, it was just they were trying to get out.
Well, how
Um,
did it get that deep in the earth? I guess is my question.
well, I mean, you're talking about however many
Years,
millions
mills
of years
and
ago, there was not a
5 million years
city
ago.
there,
Yeah.
right? So it was probably, it's already deep underground, so it could have been a mudslide or a storm or something, and it drowned all of them. I don't know, but then again, how would it get in?
I love,
Maybe the
yeah,
aliens starved to death inside the compartments because they
yeah.
can
See,
get
this
out.
is this is kind of one of the things I love about this movie, and I did include it in our book, Hidden Horror, because I think it's one that, certainly if you're a Hammer fan, you probably aren't going to come to right out of the gate. Um, and I think it takes a little bit of looking, but once you find it, like there's so much in this little, 97-minute movie, and it's got huge ideas. And again, I feel like even though like the special effects are a little dodgy, the what ends up on the screen is so kind of chewy, and you can, should you choose to, think about it for a while afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was telling Bill that I would, it's a shame that they don't have more movies like this, you
Mm.
know, big screen, even modestly budgeted, big ideas, sci-fi. And if I thought that I could trust anybody in Hollywood with the material, I would say, hey, just remake this movie, do a whole new Quatermass series.
I'm genuinely curious. I have never sought it out, but I would like to see the original 6-part BBC version because, A, obviously there's more to it, but B, Andre Morel, who we last saw in the Plague of the Zombies, he played Quatermass. And I do like me some Andre Morel, so it'd be fun to watch him in a 6-part BBC series. Uh, but yeah, I'm sure it's out there on the internet somewhere.
Well, put a pin in that, because I may be able to, I may be able
Hmm.
to make that happen. But we'll
Oh,
talk later.
I see. Okay.
But let's
Thanks,
see.
Bill.
Yeah, I didn't say that.
Nope,
Um,
I did.
but yeah, I'm trying to think of, is there anything else that we
Well,
haven't
I'd like
really
to talk
covered
a
of
little bit
significance here?
about our actors. Um, James Donald, who plays Dr. Roney, he was top billed, which is interesting that Quatermass doesn't even get top billing in his own movie. But James Donald, who plays Professor Roney, he had just come off of the success of The Great Escape and Bridge on the River Kwai. And so while he wasn't a star, he was certainly, he had been in higher rated material. And so that's why he got top billing. And then Andrew Keir was relatively new to the party. He'd done Dracula Prince of Darkness the year before, and I think that's how he got the gig. But I know that they also were looking at like Americans like Van Heflin. Who else did they say? Oh, Peter Finch, Kenneth Moore, Jack Hawkins, Trevor Howard, Harry Andrews, and Andre Morel, our good friend Andre Morel, were all considered for the role before Andrew Keir got it. And then Barbara Shelley, who we also saw in Dracula, Prince of Darkness, in that wonderful like dual role where she's prim and proper until she gets bitten, and she's wild and crazy. But I think she's marvelous in this. She is clearly a woman of intelligence and beauty, and I don't know that like that the scene where she's kind of almost possessed by the aliens. I mean, I think in the hands of a lesser actress that would not have played at all. And in Shelley's hands, you know, like just watching like the stuff kind of like dance through her eyes is just kind of extraordinary. And again, if you think about like what we're talking about is just a little like, you know, metal beanie thing that's going on her head. It's not like some big special effects extravaganza. She sells that whole concept. And I mean, so much credit to her. There's a reason why she's a big hit with Hammer fans.
Yeah, and it's also, you know, just in terms of this entire film as a package, this is one of the reasons that I'm glad to have discovered these movies later in life. I don't know that I would have necessarily appreciated them when I was younger and just into slashers and things. But these are like, this movie is an example of if someone were to come to me and say, I don't know about like old science fiction or old horror movies, like they just seem kind of dumb. Like, okay, well, watch this movie and then let's talk about it afterwards, because this movie is anything but dumb, and it's super enjoyable on just about every level.
Agreed. Well, fun fact, Duncan Lamont, who plays Sladden, the guy who comes in with his drill, who I think is a great character, and he played Victor Caroon in the original BBC version of Quatermass Experiment. So it was a fun little kind of like,
was he the astronaut?
He was the astronaut in the
Wow.
BBC teleplay. So it was a fun little kind of full circle having him come back around and show up in another Quatermass movie, and who also gets kind of like possessed, you know.
Right, especially because he just kind of shows up as this, you know, the working class guy with the drill, like, yeah,
Right.
it's just another job, whatever. And I don't know what you think you got in here, but then when he gets taken over, he's completely changed and freaked out, and it's just this wonderful contrast, just from a storytelling perspective and also from a performance angle. Yeah, can't be beat. But yeah, what are we talking about next month?
Oh man, I should have had this pulled up. Last month I was so prepared, and this month not so much.
Especially if you're thinking about this year, it's only September tomorrow.
I know. Well, the fact that it's already September makes me like freak out. September, we are doing 1968's The Devil Rides Out, starring Christopher Lee in a rare heroic role.
It sounds almost like a Western.
It does sound a little bit like a Western, which is why they changed it to The Devil's Bride for the American release. Speaking of which, we should also let Quatermass was not, as with Quatermass Experiment and a Quatermass 2, Quatermass was not a known quantity in the US. And so they had retitled those films as The Creeping Unknown. I forget what Quatermass 2's Enemy from Space. And this one was known as 5 Million Years to Earth. That was the American title. So yes, there are so many of little switcheroos for the UK title versus the American title. But yes, The Devil Rides Out will be our next feature. It's got lots of mysticism and occultism, and I think you'll dig it.
Awesome. Well, first of all, 5 million years to Earth doesn't even make sense, because it didn't take them that long to get here. It should be 5 million years in the Earth, which sounds like you're talking about a documentary about graves.
And nobody wants to see that.
No, but speaking of things that nobody wants to see, I'm just speculating. So Bill asked me this question, and I didn't have a good answer for it. Why did we not talk about Quatermass 2?
Because I knew I wanted to talk about this film, and I didn't want to foist a Quatermass double feature or triple feature on you over the course of 1 year. But I think Quatermass 2 is a great movie, but I think Quatermass 1 and 2 are kind of a piece. And so, you know, you're not going to get anything from two that you don't get from one, and vice versa. So I thought we'd go with the intro. We'd go with the later one, which is a different kind of incarnation. It's also shows Hammer at a different stage of their career. QUATERMASS Experiment was basically the beginning of Hammer horror. And at this point, 1967, Hammer has ridden high for over a decade, or rather a decade. 1957 was Curse of Frankenstein. That's when they really, you know, exploded onto the international scene. And so here they are, and they're able to kind of like explore interestingly, you know, this one, because of the lack of name recognition, this one was a harder sell than say another Dracula or another Frankenstein. So I'm glad it happened, but that was ultimately why I decided we would talk about Quatermass and the Pit, because I think it's a really fine slice of Hammer that maybe doesn't get as much attention as it should.
All right. Well, we'll put Quatermass 2 on the list for next year.
Grandson
I think
of Hammerland.
I was going to say stepson, you know, because it's kind of like that. We didn't quite
Adopted son. Yes.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you very much again for another great conversation about a really wonderful film. This series keeps surprising me as we go deeper and deeper into Hammer. Have we, refresh me again, I've got a terrible memory. Have we talked about any real stinkers in the last couple of years?
Oh gosh, I mean, I hope not. I don't know. I mean, I don't remember what your disposition, if there were any stinkers in the Dracula or Frankenstein. I don't feel like there were.
Even the lowest points from my recollection was that it's pretty good.
Still interesting. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, that's the, you know, I wonder, is it possible for a film studio? Because as you mentioned, they had their heyday and then they kind of petered out. But from my vantage point, and maybe it would have been different if I had been going through this at the time they were releasing, it's like, oh, another Hammer film. But even on their downslide, there's still a lot of terrific movies in there. So
there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of quality. If you have a taste for Hammer, they don't often disappoint. I think, gosh, I'd have to, if I could come up with like my bottom 5 Hammer, I'll try and do that for the next installment, everybody, to like the ones that I just really don't think are very good. Like things like, which is like the dinosaur free cave people epic. Like that's kind of like, I don't need to watch that again anytime soon. Things like that.
So your bottom 5 Hammers are probably like the 3-star movies.
Right. Well, you when you get around to watching The Creatures of the World Forgot, you'll tell me how many stars it deserves, because I'm kind of like, I mean, yes, there are people running around in fur bikinis and such. That's about it. That's what it's got going for it.
Well, again, I don't feel like I need to see that.
If you're going to hand out 3 stars for that.
No, probably not. Unless it's, again, Raquel Welch. But all right. Well, sir, thank you again. We'll wrap it up here. And yeah, we'll be back next month talking about the devil riding out again with his bride or something. But yeah. All right, man. Take it easy.
Class dismissed.
Yes. Wait, that's the wrong show.